This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Garett, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast.
Thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
So for those watching the video version, we are discussing Garett's book here, The Culture Transplant, How Migrants Make the Economies They Move to a Lot Like the Ones They Left. So maybe can you just give a broad overview of what your book's going to talk about, and then maybe we'll drill down to some specifics?
Sure. There's been an academic literature for the last, going on the last 15 years now, I'd say. And it's been looking at this question of, it's a new take on the question of why some countries are so much richer than others, right? So much more productive than others. And the answer that some folks started finding early on was that, in a way, just checking a common sense idea that when Europeans moved, for instance, around the world, often in evil ways after 1492, the places they went to ended up economically a lot like the places they left, right? So we refer in academic research to North America, Australia, New Zealand as Neo-Europes. And the reason we refer to them as Neo-Europes isn't because people there were particularly interested in reading Shakespeare or interested in reading Locke or Hume. It was because they were the descendants of Europeans, right? And so what this early literature did is look more systematically at this question. If you knew how productive a place was in 1500, and then you kept track of where the descendants of those folks moved after 1492, after 1500, for the next 5 centuries, how did those places turn out? And it, both in the Americas and in Southeast Asia, both when Europeans moved and when people from China moved, right? In both of these cases, the places people moved to turned out a lot like the places they left. This is known as the deep roots literature. It's actually one strand of what's called the deep roots literature. Basically, if you know the history of a place, or you know the history of the people who live in that place, which is the better predictor of modern prosperity? And it turns out that you'd rather know the history of the people than the history of the place. It's a small test of this idea of culture versus geography as two competing explanations for the wealth of nations.
Okay, great. Yeah, so let me make some statements, and then you chime in and either tweak or say, "Wow, you hit it out of the park there." Yeah. Okay, so and I'm relying on what I read in your book, but also like connecting it to what I think I knew in general. So again, and for people who don't know, if you look at like global GDP per capita or something, or if you're restricted to Europe or whatever, it's kind of flat for thousands of years, and then it just blows up coming into, what we call the Industrial Revolution, or, based on the timing. And so why is that? And so one answer that seems pretty intuitive, especially to economists who are real hard-boiled, and is to say, oh, well, it's, saving and capital investment. But I think I even had you on, Garett, with the solo model and the standard workhorse model. Like, that can explain some things, but in terms of just like why in general do the people in this country, why are they 5 times higher standard of living than these people over here, especially for decades, that by itself really doesn't work. And then you say, oh, well, no, it's institutions, or maybe it's the support for like the preference for entrepreneurship or whatever, like parents being happy if their kid grows up to be a merchant and not just go work for the government. And then also you say geography, but I took you to be saying, yes, like if you do regressions with saying, GDP growth, if you score higher on the Fraser Institute of Economic Freedom Index, sure, there's a definite strong correlation there, or, the volatility of the business cycle, whatever. But that now economists are coming around to the idea, and some of them had to be dragged kicking and screaming, that, okay, but to just say it's institutions, that sort of raises the question, well, how come this country has better institutions than that one? Exactly. And then culture matters.
Yes, this question of why institutions differ, it's usually the way I phrase it when speaking with most folks. When I talk to academic economists, I use their jargon. But when talking with most folks, the right way to talk about it is to ask the question, why do institutions differ so much across countries? And some people want to say it's only because of something that happened long ago, back in the days of when the One Ring was cast, right? people want to say there's something that happened a long time ago that shaped institutions, and it'll never happen again, we promise. So those folks will often say, this is something that Alex Naraste at Cato says. He says he believes in the deep roots once theory. He believes that basically people can migrate, that the post-1500 migrations, those changed institutions, but modern migration will not change institutions. He promises it'll never happen, right? I think that's empirically false. Modern migrations have changed institutions. One important example of this that I think is good for the world is that the migration of African Americans from the South to the North is part of the reason we got the Civil Rights Movement. There's, a variety of forms of evidence that show this, that basically when African Americans moved from places they couldn't vote to places they could, politicians started paying attention. That's part of the reason we got the Civil Rights Movement. On a more evil note, there's a new literature called the Confederate Diaspora Literature, looking at where Confederates moved after the Civil War. And places they moved ended up with more racist institutions than places they did not move. And these are just two examples showing that in the last 150, 200 years, migrations have changed institutions. So institutions are not cast in stone. A meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 did not permanently set America's institutions. It's constantly up for debate. And this is true not just in America, but for the world as a whole.
Okay, and is a good example also of this effect, you talked about Argentina at some length. Do you want to just go over that? Like, I think people are vaguely familiar with it, but then you brought in the culture.
Yes. I bring up the case of Argentina because it's like an N equals 1. It's a case study, right? And we should never generalize from case studies. But economists are so interested in this question of why Argentina used to be one of the richest places in the world, and now it's sort of a global mediocrity, right? That's an interesting question for economists. And one important answer to the question that you'll find if you read normal historical literature about Argentina is that the liberal elites of Argentina decided they needed a lot of migrants who would come in from elsewhere and who would come in and basically help the economy. And so they welcomed a lot of migrants, especially from Italy. And a lot of those migrants brought ideas about socialism and anarchism that hadn't been present in Argentina beforehand. The elites had hoped that the migrants would move to the countryside and stay politically docile, but a sizable number of them and their descendants moved to the big cities. And cities, of course, are a great place of political ferment and have been for a long time. And so those, the first and second, especially the second generation of migrants, brought in basically socialism and anarchism. And I actually would disclaim the idea that Perón was literally the child of these political movements. Mm-hmm. Instead, he was more like a Trump-type figure trying to synthesize the weird mix of stuff that was going on in his country. So Peronism is a response. It's not the child of those Italian socialist and anarchist migrants, but it's a synthesis, which is what we get in politics, right? We don't get either or, we get both and. So again, normal mainstream political historians are often very excited to report this. Hey, look, migrants came, they saw things were bad, and they made things better. And my guess is a lot of the folks listening to your podcast will not be sympathetic to the idea that the wave of political reforms that happened in Argentina from the 30s, 40s, 50s was a step in the right direction. But nevertheless, they did seem to change politics. That's what normal historians say. It's something we should put some weight on. Migrants can come and change things. This is something progressives should be more excited about, I think, from their point of view.
Okay, and then maybe the flip side of that, your intriguing opening, I don't know if it was a forward or introduction chapter, where you talk about the ideal, or maybe you said optimal, I forget which word you used, immigration policy with respect to China. Do you want to just go over what, your quick argument there, just so people can see where you're coming from?
Yeah. I think it's important to believe that migration can improve a nation's institutional quality. I think this is something that this is something that open borders activists have to completely deny. They have to deny that migration can make your government's institutions better because they have to believe that migrants are politically inert. They and their descendants are politically inert. Instead, I think the best migration policy for the world's poorest countries would be to just invite a lot of people to voluntarily migrate from China and stay for a long time, stay for generations. And I think, I pick a few examples in the book, but I think if we pick countries in the bottom 20th and the bottom decile, the bottom 10% of the world's economies, the bottom 20%, a great policy reform those countries could make would be to invite people from China to come and move long term. If Madagascar, for instance, right, an island country off the coast of Africa, could have enough migrants to come in so that over the course of 20, 30 years, 20 or so percent of their population was of Chinese descent, it's safe to predict that they would develop an obvious large entrepreneurial class within a generation or two. Why can I say that? Because it's happened basically everywhere else in the world large numbers of Chinese migrants have gone. The Chinese diaspora has been studied quite heavily, especially in Southeast Asia. And I think that that's a lesson that we can draw from. That I think the first generation, you get this entrepreneurship that you see that's so visible, that's happened so much around the world. And the second generation, you see government institutions starting to improve. And all of a sudden, these countries like Malaysia, to pick an example, start showing up really as a pretty good performer in free market capitalism indices, right? So a way to improve your institutions is bring in people whose ancestors have a history of improving institutions. Okay,
so just to pull on that thread a little bit. So here we're going to be engaging in stereotypes. There's no way around it, but at least they're complementary. We're not. Like I've noticed in the United States, in my travels, especially in more urban areas, that there's a lot of Chinese immigrants, and the stereotype is that they open up either a dry cleaner or a Chinese restaurant, and the whole family's working, and they're all industrious, and they save a lot. And the 12-year-old kid is either working the register, and he knows how to make change, so that's a good sign, or he's over in the corner doing his homework, but he's still at the family. And so you just say, other things equal, that family unit, that kid is going to have a huge advantage, and then that kid's kid, and you can see how even if they barely speak the language, but no, they can still run a business and and maybe people who are already there give them a little bit of tips as to how do you open up a franchise or whatever. But nonetheless, you can see why that works. And so if they're getting spread all over the planet Earth, especially coming into areas where, because you said like the bottom 20%. Well, as an economist, we know probably part of the reason these countries are in the bottom 20% is they don't have a strong entrepreneurial element in their existing society. So these people come in who are real hard workers, know how to run a business, and don't mind working, 80 hours a week to get it going, and they save a lot. That's going to help things.
Now, let me comment on that a bit.
Yes.
There. For instance, I would say that first generation migrants from wherever they come from are really exceptions to any rule, right? They're positively selected. If you make it to a place like the U.S., you put in a lot of effort, and you were willing to break a lot of ties, and you were in some level a rule breaker. Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right that there are that first generation Chinese migrants are fairly likely to be successful in entrepreneurial industries and set up a lot of them. But that's kind of common for a lot of migrant groups. Most of my interest is in the second generation and beyond. Mm-hmm. So you're right about the first generation, but the second generation and beyond is really where the action is, because I'm interested in the long run here. Second, there's an interesting quirk. This is something that a lot of my GMU colleagues and our grad students focus on, that there are different kinds of entrepreneurship. And this is something but I need to explain it for the audience, right? There's that very mini, like small business entrepreneurship, somebody selling things on a street corner, somebody selling hot dogs on a street corner, somebody having a small little shop. That's one kind of entrepreneurship, and that can be important in its way. The kind of entrepreneurship that seems to matter most for a nation's long-run productivity is the kind of entrepreneurship where you scale up, where you build a business that can scale, where you do something that can take advantage of Adam Smith's division of labor. So building that second kind of entrepreneurship is the kind that's probably going to be changing societies more. And that's something we should keep in mind. Like the first generation is totally interesting, but first generation migrants everywhere are big outliers. And America's really lucky to get them, right? It's the second generation where we need to keep most of our investigation if we're looking at the questions I'm interested in. How a nation's institutions change, what matters for the long run.
Okay, great. So can you expand a little bit more, though, when you say that, for those bottom 20%, getting immigrants from China, for example, like, there's a lot worse things they can do than that. And you say because they improve their institutions. What do you mean though? Because I think everyone gets the idea that, some guy comes in and opens up a Chinese restaurant that's good for the community. But does that mean, and so now everyone decides there should be less corruption with City Hall? You know what I mean? Like when we talk about institutions, it seems like we mean more than just there's some successful businesses. So what?
Yeah. Let me take the easy path out here, which is to first say that some of it's not institutions. Some of it is actually the thing I talked about in our last podcast, which is the savings rate thing, this sort of solo-ish kind of thing. It turns out that there are now there's studies from multiple countries showing that people tend to import their savings rate from their country of origin. And this shows up in the second generation at least. We have a study of migrants to the UK, study of migrants to the US, study of migrants to Germany. And in all of these cases, in the second generation, it turns out you can predict the savings behavior of second generation migrants to a country by knowing what the savings rate is back home. So, and, there's, like I said before, the solo model tells us that, savings can't matter that much because there's diminishing returns to capital, but it doesn't hurt. I also see that, however, as a signal of foresightedness more broadly. If you're willing to save, that's a sign of giving more thought for the morrow, not less. And that's probably going to show up in a lot of areas of life in terms of planning and the foresightedness that's important to modern capitalism. Second, when I push on this story of why it'll affect institutions, one obvious answer, one easy one, is through voting. Now, a lot of these countries in the bottom 20% aren't democracies, right? But at the very least, politicians do pay attention to the citizens of the country, and a more foresighted populace makes it easier for politicians to plan for the long run and to make a trade-off between short-run pain and long-term gain.
Okay.
That angle where I have to be most speculative, but which a channel I personally believe in, because I think it's a theory thing, is that even if there's a crummy, incompetent elite that's in charge of the country and they're going to be in charge for a long time, they're smart enough to know that if they can give capitalists an incentive to build something that lasts a long time, that the elites can tax those capitalists more 10 years from now if they let them build something with better institutions, under a better rule of law, with a little less corruption. So this is a version of so Daron Acemoglu wrote a paper on this, basically arguing, and it was called "Why Isn't There a Political Coast Theorem?" or "Why Not a Political Coast Theorem?" And he says, basically, why is it that so many governments seem to focus on the short run rather than the long run? And one possible answer to that is that they just don't see that much benefit to focusing on the long run. But if you've got an incipient entrepreneurial class in your country that could be building semiconductor factories in 10 years, you have an incentive to treat them nicely so that you can tax them more later rather than tax them less now.
And ironically, this overlaps with some of the work of Hans Hoppe that...
Yeah, I've thought about this fact, right? Yeah, this sort of the case for monarchism is a focus on the long run, right?
Right. Yeah, the democracy, among other problems one might have with it, is that this temporary caretaker that, like, progressives often say, it's these capitalists, like someone who owns a private forest is just going to cut all the trees down. And it's like, no, actually, it's the exact opposite, that you have the capital value and so on. Like you cut at the optimal time as far as productivity, whereas someone who's a bureaucrat managing a national park and can give sweetheart deals to private loggers, that guy has no interest. If the next guy, someone else wins the election in 4 years, then maybe I'm out of the job, and that guy's buddies are going to get, so. Okay, so there's all that. So, all right. So where does this leave us then? What's your big picture takeaway? Are you saying you think that the immigration debate, certainly among free market libertarianish economists, ought to focus more on culture? Because like I think you said a moment ago, like they kind of have to just say, no, I don't, either that's not relevant or that's not happening, or you're just making a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to spend more time asking where institutions come from and how they change. And we should look at absolutely normal mainstream evidence on this question, because there's a ton of it. Really, my book is, I'd say 2/3 of it is basically 2/3 of my book is, well, let me say, half my book is just reporting literature that's sitting there buried in the dusty journals that regular folks don't know about, that even pretty well-informed people don't know about. So I'm here to surprise people with facts they haven't heard of. Another quarter of my book is kind of connecting the dots to say, like, these things are all connected. The fact that second generation migrants import savings rates from their home countries to the new ones, that helps explain why how immigration can either increase or reduce your nation's rate of saving, right? Mm-hmm. And I connect the dots between those kind of shorter run studies, a century or less, and these longer run studies of centuries or more, looking at how migration since 1500, when we ran a big evil experiment, teaches us things that would never get past a university institutional ethics board, but that we can actually learn from to learn about the wealth of nations. That the European migrations, Chinese migrations, were natural experiments that showed us that culture gets transplanted and it persists. And it changes productivity in the places people move to. Third, I think the final part of my book is telling people this really matters for global well-being. If we so about most of the world's new ideas, most of the world's awesome innovations come from about 7 countries, what I call the I-7, the most innovative 7 countries. And so if those countries have their institutions weakened even slightly through poorly chosen migration policies, that's going to hurt the whole world. So the whole world has a stake in the innovative potential of the I-7. So the 7 are, the US is 1, of course, and 3 are in Asia, China, South Korea, Japan, and then 3 are in Europe, Germany, France, and the UK. Now, these are countries that are big. They have a lot of population. So, like, scale matters when it comes to innovation. And we should remember that all of us rely on what's going on in these countries. There are a lot of other countries that are innovative per capita, but they just don't have enough capitas. So this is why I think that if we're going to run an open borders experiment, we should run open borders in countries that are small and that are not crucial contributors to the world's innovative potential. That's why I believe openly and candidly in open borders for Iceland. So Iceland should be the place where we run open borders. And, if we made it as dense as Singapore, we could probably have 300, maybe 500 million people there, right? And if the open borders activists are right and institutions don't change when people move there, then that'll teach us an important lesson. But if institutions do change when people move there, we can draw from that lesson as well. So let's not run the experiment in the I-7.
Okay. Let me throw some, just to help people think through the implications of all this.
Yeah.
So you just said that, hey, China's up there in the I-7. Let's not mess with China, and we don't want to do anything. If a bunch of smaller countries around the world adopted your recommended policy, wouldn't that suck the best people from China away, like the most entrepreneurial and whatever? And then wouldn't that leave China worse off institutional wise?
Oh, that's actually a great point. That's actually a very good point.
You sound like you're surprised.
No, that's a good one. I haven't heard that one. I've done how many interviews have I done? You're the first one to make that. That's a great one. I love that. Yeah. So yeah, you're that's actually a reasonable point, right? That one should be concerned about a brain drain from the most innovative places if they go to a place that's less innovative. Now, there's some chance that, for one thing, I would point out that first-generation migrants are pretty mobile, right? So suppose hypothetically the experiment's going really well and Iceland, ends up becoming a massive innovation powerhouse because of a lot of Chinese migration, right? Then we've just added some new productive potential. I mean, I do think that China's innovativeness is held back by their crummy institutions. I mean, they have mediocre institutions. They have some, good scientific stuff going on, but they're mostly making it up at scale. I mean, 1.2 billion people, you can have a mediocre level of institutional quality and still make it up on volume. That's been the Chinese story for a while. Moving them to a place that had better institutions, even if it only lasts 20, 30 years, could still be helping the world a lot. I mean, I have a hunch I know in practice, nobody's actually going to run the literal experiment I'm asking for, right? Mm-hmm. I think if Iceland decided to go big, just to get hypothetical here, if Iceland decided to go big for a high-skilled migration approach and ended up with a lot of Chinese scientists there, I mean, I think that would actually be a net plus for the world right now. Just to be honest.
Okay.
Because Iceland has pretty good institutions, right? There's a lot of cool tech stuff going on and geothermal and whatnot. I got to go there a year or two ago and drove around. It was like, oh, you can tell they're doing stuff. So,
okay, yeah. Maybe just if you can expand a little bit, because I think I'm a little confused about some of the ambiguity in the terms here. If you were to ask me what are some of the countries that have really good institutions, especially in terms of making them poised for economic growth and so on, I would not have listed China in absolute terms. I would say they're much better now than they were under Mao, and that I think helps explain. But in terms of just if we were going to model countries, hold up countries as models, I don't think China would make the top 5.
No, but they've got 1.2 billion people, right? So they've got more than 10 times the population of Japan, right?
Right. So why? I guess that's what I'm still. Why the bottom decile country? If they had a bunch of Japanese immigrants, would that even be better? But it's just there's not as much of supply, so that's why you don't hold that up as a possibility.
No, I think one thing that I point out is that China is the world's poorest Chinese country, and so there seems to be something incredibly sticky and crummy about Chinese communism, right? And the CCP is sticky there, and it's holding back the country, right? And so, there was an old cliche that people used to say much more often, which is that people of a Chinese background are successful everywhere in the world except for China. And then as the 90s, that became less true, right? So people stopped saying it. But still, in median income terms, or however we look at it, people in China are held back by being in China on average, right? Mm-hmm. So if they could move to and the way to look at this is you look at Singapore, you look at Hong Kong, rest in peace. You look at Taiwan. These are countries that are majority Chinese and much more productive, right? So once folks of Chinese background are out away from the CCP, on average, they're a lot more productive. So finding a way to get them into a place where they're more productive would be great. So China's making up on scale. I think that's in a way India is like an honorable mention in the National Innovation Olympics. And again, they're making it up on scale too, right? They've got 1 billion folks. Mm-hmm. And with that many, when the median country in the world has like 9 million people in it. And if India has like 100 times more than that, I mean, they can be a lot less effective per capita, but they just make it up on capitas. Because remember, when it comes to innovation, what we care about is the total number of ideas per planet, not the total number of ideas per country. And we're still holding at one planet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so again, with this stuff here, I'm just trying to throw stuff at you like this.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
just playful. So, I'm just putting your framework through a wind tunnel here. So, all right, so China starts out right now, and then the globe follows your advice, and so lots of a decent percentage of the Chinese population emigrates, and still we're looking at the CCP. That's really China's institutions in China are not great. What could we do? And someone says, if we could just get a bunch of Chinese people to immigrate into China, that should improve their.
Yes.
So
you're right.
What's going on? So like you get where I'm coming from, right? How come right now, if they got all the Chinese people there, their institutions aren't awesome? Something.
My story is there's something. I mean, the world always has weird outliers, and for the last few decades, our weird outlier has been the stickiness of communist autocracies in a couple of countries, right? So. And I think that's something, I mean, we all basically know, very few people would doubt that North Korea would be vastly richer if Kim Jong-un just went away and they found even a mediocre form of democratic capitalism there, right? The place would just start getting super rich by their current standards overnight. Right. So this is a sort of political economy problem that I'm sort of whistling past the graveyard on. Why are there these two countries in the world, North Korea and China, where these crummy institutions are really sticky, really rigid? We could look to Cuba similarly and say, there the difference isn't as extreme, but a lot of people throughout Latin America look around at Cuba and they're like, you guys weren't that way before, and there's something really bad happening now. There's some kind of stickiness about communist dictatorship, and they've been hard to shake. When they all got shook off in Eastern Europe, more or less, or many countries in Eastern Europe after 1990, and we saw the changes there, right? But there are a couple places where the stickiness of communism is something that is poorly understood, and I'm treating it as just a fact we can't get away from. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to advocate like militaristic revolution or invasion or anything kind of crazy like that. That's just not my thing. So,
is it possible? And again, we're kind of doing like a just so story here when we know what the answer is, and we're just trying to. But is it something possibly because it is kind of a weird juxtaposition where on the one hand, China's institutions aren't very good in the absolute sense, but yet you're also saying, and China is this center of these flows of people who are all bringing their great institutional baggage with them to bring up this. Is weird. And could it be that somehow, go back, whether it's Confucius or whatever, but the culture, like the cultural habits and family structures and whatever social values that the Chinese people have is so robust that they can limp along with a terrible communist hierarchy sitting on that, whereas other places it wouldn't have worked. And so that's why you see it persisting over in China. It's like that the one is they're so hardy that they're able to withstand and carry communism.
Yeah, I think that's a totally reasonable way to put it, right? If basically, if we look at in 1500, China was very close to the economic and technological frontier, right? And you could even, depending on which scholars you pay attention to, which you place more weight on, that may have lasted even until 1800, right? So a lot of my folks in the GMU orbit, the economic history orbit, study that, and they debate 1500, 1800. How long did they stay at close to the economic frontier? And but even in these earlier centuries, even before the 20th century, the Chinese diaspora had a reputation for being quite successful. We can always wonder about whether all of that is selection or most of that is selection, right? The best folks are getting out. Right. There's always an element of that going on. But the fact that they stood out so quickly and for so long, and that it's lasted across generations. The fact that Chinese diasporas, which arrived long ago in, say, the Philippines, are still form much of the economic elite of the country seems really important. It's a reminder that full assimilation is a myth. People who embrace something like open borders often say, oh, within a generation or two, everybody will assimilate. They'll all start eating hamburgers after a while, and then they've assimilated. But all you have to do is look at the Chinese diaspora across Southeast Asia, and you say, like, wow, they managed to keep their cultural separateness to some degree, in some countries more than others. Thailand, they've integrated quite a lot. But they did not assimilate. The Chinese diaspora, on average, has not assimilated to the lower productivity of the countries they moved to. So, and if the Chinese diaspora isn't assimilating to the lower productivity of the places they moved to, we should be skeptical of the view that people immigrating from less productive countries will automatically assimilate upward to the productivity of the United States. We know it doesn't go down, so maybe it doesn't come up. Or maybe they both only go halfway, something like that. We should draw lessons from the Chinese diaspora about how full assimilation is a myth. Okay.
Maybe at this point, we can bring up another. Well, actually, I got two things. I'm going to jot a note.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I don't want to lose this. Is what you're doing, there's a phrase in this literature, something like, we wanted workers and instead we got people. Am I getting it right? Is that,
yes.
Can you
just there's a little something like that. Yeah.
Expand, like what is that supposed to capture? And then, how does that relate to what we're talking about?
Yes. George Borjas made that sort of title of a book of his, right? He referred to it in the title of a recent book he wrote. And it had been around for a while. Like a lot of immigration advocates are often actually, in a way, really responding to the demands of capitalists, right? People who own capital want more labor to work with their capital because it makes their capital more productive, right? Often, these capitalists end up disappointed because these folks show up and start pushing for making political demands that make their life tougher, right? Pushing to unionize. And Argentina is an extreme example of that, of course, right? So yes, we should remember that institutions are heavily shaped by the people who show up, right? So institutions, especially in democracies, but not only in democracies, the institutions we wind up with are shaped by the people who are in the country. And it's a pretty good predictor, like where people come from is a pretty good predictor of institutional quality. That's part of what the Deep Roots literature is showing. And it's a reminder we can't just hold institutions constant and imagine adding new people to the same old institutions. It won't happen instantly. It won't happen in 5 years. It won't happen in 10 years. But over the course of a generation or two, when new folks show up, they'll be changing institutions and in somewhat predictable directions. And we should draw on really public choice to learn about this.
Mm-hmm. So the way I've seen that element in the more like Austro-libertarian literature is to say that we should not, or the arguments being made is we shouldn't think, if you understand the standard case for free trade in goods, that doesn't automatically lead just one step later to, so therefore you should let workers come and go too, because it's the same thing. It's just, labor services instead of, some final product, for the exact reason you're saying there, that no, there's an important difference. When you bring in a TV, the TV is just a good sitting there. Right. Yeah. Whereas you bring in a worker, it's not merely, the labor services flowing out of his body at the factory, that now he is living in your community, and maybe that has some other impacts.
He could be unionizing. He could be pushing for communist revolution. He could be pushing for, a bunch of crummy government regulations. And he could be very successful at it. Maybe he's really skilled at it. And that could end up having a lot of negative externalities, a lot of negative spillovers. So, this is all about going back to this question of, where do institutions come from? Where does national productivity come from? And a lot of it comes from the norms, the cultural values, the political institutions, and there's all this. It ends up starting looking like a big web where everything's interconnected. And it's hard to see cause and effect sometimes. But when we treat migration as a fairly clean natural experiment, then we can see, I can see which way the arrow is pointing in this particular case. A bunch of folks moved from this place to that place, and then like 30 or 40 years later, the government changed. So,
okay, so what do you say to? I'm only going to talk about the U.S. because that's the only place that I know it all.
Yeah.
Certainly, we've got anecdotal things like Cuban people coming from Cuba into Florida, for example, are the most hardcore right-wing conservative. Absolutely, I love this country. Yeah. You don't love it. Get out of here, you commie pinko.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also, I know,
as far as I know, that's lasted into the second generation, right? I mean, I haven't seen a study, but it all seems to fit that.
And then also, again, speaking with broad brushstrokes here, folks, and I know there's a Hispanic population in California that's very conservative, traditional, like they believe, only men and women should get married and blah, 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 that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so they might, that on some ballot initiatives, that was actually a stumbling block that you might have thought, California, crazy progressive, but no, like among certain groups on some social issues, they were actually pretty old fashioned. So does that, I guess the question could be are you just bringing up the theoretical possibility and saying we know there's some pockets, or are you saying in the context of the U.S. immigration debate, couldn't some of the either literally open borders or very open borders sympathetic people say empirically what you're talking about just isn't true in U.S. politics, that no, the immigrants actually tend to be more conservative socially?
Yeah, so this is all totally testable. I think we're at the point where we need to be sticking with the glib generalizations, the things that can be run and tested empirically and repeatedly in a lot of studies. And so, for instance, I can say stuff about the migration of savings rates because I have studies from multiple countries. And that means I can only look, for instance, at the things that are measured and tested repeatedly. It kind of ties your hands, right? This is a little bit like the debate about, is GDP the right measure of output? Shouldn't I be worrying about some other kind of well-being that's a little bit harder to measure? The problem is those other kinds of well-being just haven't been measured enough for me to make a big generalization. I can say with a high degree of reliability that on average, trust, attitudes toward the role of government, and savings rates migrate from one country to another, and that all of those are pretty important. So, for instance, with this does come up in one famous paper in the literature. People of Mexican descent, Mexican Americans, do appear to import the lower levels of trust that exist in Mexico. They import, say, half of it, right? And that's not a small thing, right? So the things you're talking about the cultural conservatism here and loving Ronald Reagan in Cuba, among Cuban Americans, that kind of stuff, those things are important little nuances, but the generalization underneath it has to be kept in mind, which is that I can be quite confident that these statements about savings, about trust, about the proper role of government, on average, will be important. And if one wants to make basically artisanal exceptions to the rule, which I think happens a lot in the U.S. immigration debate, you see a lot of people saying, "Oh, I have an artisanal exception to the rule. I know, it's basically the equivalent of, I know somebody who's pretty short and who's good at basketball." Right? Like, I'm sure you do. Like, those people do exist in the real world, but we shouldn't build our basketball staffing policy around that exception. We should learn the general rule and then treat the exceptions as exceptions.
Okay, so I'm just at this because it just popped in my head when you said that.
Yeah.
It seems kind of funny. Are you saying, like, suppose there's some extremely libertarian person who's skeptical of immigrants, and if you just said, yeah, I mean, a lot of these immigrants coming in, they don't trust the government back home. And it's like, oh, these are my people. Like, why is that a problem if they have, or they don't trust big corporations? A lot of, right on, brother. So,
well, the usual question the most robust question that's been used about trust is, in general, do you think people can be trusted, or in general, can't you be too careful in dealing with others? That's basically the question. So it's not about trust in corporations or trust in the government. It's trust about people in general.
Okay.
And it turns out that predicts it predicts experimental behavior in an interesting way. Like, in about half the studies, people who say you can trust strangers are more likely to trust in experiments, and in the other half of the studies, people who say you can trust strangers are more likely to be trustworthy. So there's a whole literature, and people have never really, to my knowledge, figured out the pattern. But in a lot of market interactions are a lot easier to go through when you feel like you can honestly trust the strangers you're dealing with. It's easier to say, oh yeah, I'm going to hand this bank my money. I'm going to let this guy mow my lawn when I'm not there, or clean my house when I'm not there. That kind of generalized trust facilitates a lot of economic transactions. So that's the question that gets asked the most. I have to say it happens not because I think it's the most important question, but I think it's one that both economists, sociologists, political scientists, they all liked asking it. So we got a lot of studies on it. Personally, I like the savings rate one because it's harder to argue with it. It's harder to debate. Well, is savings really important? So
on the trust, can you just elaborate? Because this came up. It was that Harari guy, like one of the brain trust over in the World Economic Forum. And he recently had a thing where he was trashing Bitcoin. So whatever one thinks of Bitcoin, but his complaint was, oh, the fact that it's touted as a trustless network, and that's no good. We want, and to me that seemed goofy, like complaining about people putting locks on their doors. Like, I guess with the trust thing, like, and you alluded to it when you were talking about how there's this connection, but other things equal, I would much rather have people coming in who are trustworthy, and I don't care whether they trust other people or not.
Yeah. This is again one of the issues in the literature, right? Some studies seem to find that people who say you can trust most people are themselves more trustworthy, right? And this is in economic experiments where there's actual money on the line, and but that's not a universal finding, and it's one of these things where, like, when I look at all these studies and people sum it up and they say half the time, the people who say you can trust are themselves more trustworthy, and half the times they're just more trusting. I say, well, that's a pretty good package overall. Let's just take it.
Right.
That's my take on this whole literature. Is like, there's something kind of good there. It probably has some good positive benefits, and it correlates with a lot of good things. And I can tell a story, like you said, about trustworthiness that fits pretty well.
Okay. So we're just looking at the clock here. We just got about 10 minutes or so left. So partly why it intrigued me when I saw that this was your book and I realized what you were writing on here is, to put it bluntly, you're coming from the GMU, and typically those are the very cosmopolitan, open borders people, because they like people who don't look like them. Whereas,
so do I.
The stereotype is the people who are skeptical of open borders. Really, it's just because they don't like other people,
they're like bigots and close-minded,
and they're casting about for any contrived. And you couldn't prove it in terms of GDP and wages, and so now you're casting about, maybe it'll affect institutions. And so I've definitely heard that you guys lost on the wages, and then now you just keep moving the argument because you just don't like foreigners coming in, or at least foreigners from certain places. So what do you say to that?
I think you do lose on the wages if you pick the wrong kind of immigration policy and you wait 50 years. So that's the thing. So I think.
Can you elaborate on that? So to give so people don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I have seen people like Ben Powell. I used to work for him or with him, under him at Texas Tech Free Market Institute. I like him; he's a good economist, and I've seen him get up and saying that like the best control experiment we had was the Florida, what is that called, boat lift thing, or
the Mario boat lift. Yeah,
yes, and it was like. Yeah, people with just a high school education, maybe there was a slight drop in their wages, but other than that, it looked like bringing these people in made everybody else richer. So is that wrong, or that's just not?
No, he's totally right.
Okay.
But I will say that, again, to be equally glib, 10 years is the libertarian long run. There you go. 10 years is the libertarian long run. So I am much more of a long-termist. I think that we should be thinking in terms of generations, and government changes over generations, not over years or quarters even, which is what the Mario Boatlift study was looking at, like a year or two, right? And I'm interested in this grand question of why what economists call total factor productivity differs across countries, why there's more magic in some countries than others, and in turn, why institutions differ. So, Tyler Cowan, my colleague at GMU, he interviewed Daron Acemoglu as part of his Conversations with Tyler podcast. And he kicks off the interview by saying, let me offer you a simple theory of the wealth of nations. Latitude. It turns out, as a matter of fact, how far you are from the equator is a pretty good predictor of how productive your country is. Like the highly productive countries are, on average, far from the equator. It explains maybe statistically like half or 2/3 of cross-country income differences.
And that's when you made the North Pole joke?
Yeah, exactly. So
can you tell the listeners just at least get something out of this?
Economists. The first economists who did some kind of fancy style studies of why some countries produce so much more output than others was written by two guys named Robert Hall and Charles Jones. They're both at Stanford, and what they found was that some strong predictors of whether your country was productive was whether you were whether you had a mixed economy, sort of between capitalism and socialism, and whether you were further from the equator. And so this explains why Santa Claus has the most productive economy in the world.
Yeah.
Because he's as far as possible from the equator, and he has a mixed economy, right? So it's a little joke, right? But it captures this fact that, further from the equator, closer to prosperity. And so Tyler kind of kicks this off as sort of a trolling question. He likes to launch an interview by, giving somebody, shocking them a little bit.
Right.
And Acemoglu says, no, I don't think that's what it is. But it's hard to shake that correlation, right? Problem is that if we look in the New World, before 1492, the richest areas, the most productive areas were closer to the equator. And then after the Europeans showed up, it moved to being further from the equator. So the sign flipped, right? So that magical geography story, which open borders activists have increasingly placed weight on. Libertarian open borders folks have gotten more excited about geography as time has gone on, because it's a way to argue that productivity isn't tied to people, right? Mm-hmm. So this is something I thought I was, if you had asked a version of me this 20 or 30 years ago, I would have never thought this could happen. That libertarians are becoming more wedded to the view that productivity is about geography and less about good institutions, because they know that if they believe, to the extent they believe that institutions are important, it's hard to shake the view that people can shape institutions.
Right. So, I mean, like Brian Kaplan's, real quick prima facie demonstration that open borders doubles global GDP or whatever his figure is just, you got some guy over here, he's earning $1 a day. You pick him up and put him in Indiana. Even if he's working as a greeter at Walmart, he's making a lot more than that. And so you just keep doing that, and all of a sudden global GDP, and sure, there's some issues and they got to get more sewers and blah, blah, build more apartments. But if we're going to double global GDP, we can kind of work that stuff out. Right, guys? And so, but you're saying maybe certainly not sustainably, because by moving everybody around, the very things that made his productivity so much higher in the one place might now have the rug cut out or pulled out?
Because people are externalities. People are spillovers, right? we create positive or negative externalities wherever we go. And one of the most important ones is through voting. Brian Kaplan wrote an excellent book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, which showed that people who aren't as smart are less likely to support capitalism. To me, that's a good argument for high-skilled immigration, because that means you bring in people who are more likely to support capitalism. They may not be perfect voters, but they're just more likely than average to support capitalism, and I like that. So, I would, to riff on the old line about we wanted workers, but we got people, I would say we wanted workers and we got voters.
Okay. So can we cut a deal with the open borders libertarians and say, if we just go to monarchy, then you can let in as many people as you want, and they can be vassals for the king and an Austrian king, just to make it
clear. If we can assume the can opener theory style, with no bad side effects, I'm glad to do that. But let's look in the real world and see where this is working. The only place that's working, and I think it works relatively well, are in the Gulf oil monarchies, right? Dubai, Qatar, Kuwait, in a certain way, Saudi Arabia, right? There are large classes of folks, often from the Philippines and a few other countries, who come into those countries, earn great wages. They're able to send a lot back home. One wouldn't call it a free labor market, but it is a market where they have a lot of repeat business, right? People go for 2 years, go back to their home countries, come back again. So people are voting with their feet for this system. So they're not, I want to point out, they're not just monarchies. This isn't some kind of Hoppian or anarcho-capitalist or Moldbugian sort of monarchist utopia, right? Mm-hmm. This is, for some reason, it only works in places that have a lot of oil wells sitting underneath. I'm not entirely sure why that's part of the equilibrium, but it's worth thinking through.
Okay. All right. Last minute or two here. I'll ask you one more question. You can answer it as long or short as you want. Just to, folks, we obviously, Garett and I are being a little bit cute here because we know all the different personalities involved in the debates, but just joking aside, just so people understand where you're coming from, can you explain big picture what you think the U.S. immigration policy should look like, and then contrast it with the current amount? Like, should they be letting in a lot more people per year, but of these characteristics, or make it a market thing? Like, as long as they pay a certain amount, it's not a number you have in mind, it's more criteria. Just go ahead, let it rip, and then we'll end with that.
Yeah. I'm in favor of selective expansion. I think we should have a more selective immigration policy, and we should have a lot more folks coming in. I was on a panel last summer at Econ Twitter IRL, thing I've held up in Pennsylvania, and it was great. On the panel, the other folks were not fans of my culture transplant worldview, and one of them was Leah Boustans, very smart researcher. But I was the only one who was in favor of more immigration. Mm-hmm. Like, all of the other ones were like, well, I can't extrapolate. I'm not willing to say. Maybe they had good reasons. I don't want to, say too much about their views. They were definitely not in favor of expanding immigration beyond its current levels. I said, let's go with something selective along some metric and then open it up. Have a lot more folks. So I think that's the way to go. I basically would like basically a point style system, not cutoffs, but points. And a lot of the points would be normal things like, do you have a good college education? It would be nice to find a way to integrate SAT or scores or GRE scores or something like that into that point system if you could, if it were feasible. But then also, have you come from a country that has been like a success for a while? And it may or may not be my deep roots measures. It may be, do you come from a country with a high savings rate? Do you come from a country with a high level of trust? Do you come from a country where people believe that markets are a good thing? It's basically points-based systems that are both about the person and about the country, and to a lesser extent, the country they come from, the traits of the country they come from. Basically using everything you can to make sure you're finding people who are going to make your country better 2 or 3 or 4 generations in the future.
Okay, well, great. So, folks, my guest has been Garett Jones. The book is The Culture Transplant. Garett, thanks so much for your time.
Great being back. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and we know that you're all above the cut. Thanks for joining us.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.